It began quietly, the way difficult truths often do, not with breaking headlines or flashing banners, but with a stillness that made the morning feel heavier than it should have. At first light on November 28th, a pale mist clung to the grounds of Windsor, softening the edges of the world, while something far less gentle settled inside its walls. There were no alarms, no public appearances, no hurried footsteps echoing down stone corridors, only a silence that seemed to widen with every passing minute. When the update finally appeared on the palace's official channel, it carried none of the dramatic tone the world has grown used to. It was a small notification, almost easy to overlook. Following an internal review, the future role of the Duchess of Sussex has now been formally resolved. 16 measured words, yet they landed with the weight of a verdict. Across Britain, people paused mid-sip and mid-step as the alert flashed across their screens. A baker opening shop in Manchester murmured that something felt off. An Edinburgh pensioner, who had followed the royal family for decades, reached for the remote, sensing that the story wasn't as simple as the sentence suggested. And thousands of miles away in Boston, a late-night viewer frowned at the quiet CNN banner, whispering, "Why now?" Inside the institution, those who had watched the past months unfold felt the announcement like a closing door. King Charles had become more withdrawn, William more resolute under the strain of choices he never wanted to make, and Catherine, always composed, carried a quiet sadness she couldn't quite disguise. Nothing dramatic had happened this morning, nothing dramatic had happened, and yet everything had changed. Because today's sentence signaled something the palace had avoided for nearly 4 years: a final, irreversible answer to the question of Meghan's future. Stay with me, because the path leading to this quiet announcement is filled with choices, pressures, and heartbreaks the public has never been allowed to see. To understand why the palace chose November 28th, and why its wording felt so final, we need to step back to the moment when the first cracks quietly began to form. For King Charles, the tensions surrounding Harry and Meghan were never simply personal. They were structural, touching every part of the monarchy's delicate balance: duty, public trust, political pressure, and the unspoken expectations left behind by the late Queen. In the months after Harry and Meghan stepped down in early 2020, Charles tried to maintain what he privately described as a bridge of possibility. He believed time could soften the edges of disagreement, that reconciliation, even partial, could eventually bring stability, and for a while that hope guided the palace's strategy: respond softly, delay decisions, allow space for healing. But a modern monarchy lives under relentless scrutiny, and as American media began framing Meghan as an independent figure still symbolically tied to the crown, the lines of responsibility grew harder to manage. Precedent became the heart of the problem. Under the system established during Queen Elizabeth II's reign, roles came with structure: either you were in or you were out, and the ambiguity surrounding Meghan could no longer be sustained. You were either a working royal with obligations and limitations, or you were fully private with freedom, but without institutional privileges. And Meghan's position sat uncomfortably between those two worlds. She no longer carried duties or represented the crown, yet her title Duchess of Sussex still carried global weight, and every public appearance or statement she made was inevitably interpreted through a royal lens, whether fair or not. By 2023, Charles began receiving increasingly detailed briefings from Commonwealth partners and diplomatic advisors. Some requested clarity on the Sussexes' role, while others expressed concern that global audiences couldn't distinguish between personal projects and royal endorsement. In the United States, particularly among viewers over 50, public sentiment was divided. Admiration for Meghan's independence coexisted with confusion over her continued royal ties, while in Britain, polls consistently showed a belief that the couple should never return to official duties. Through it all, Charles stayed cautious, even as the strain on the institution grew unmistakable. Modernization required coherence, stability required boundaries, and by autumn 2024, internal reviews had begun quietly and meticulously outlining what the future could and could not include, which is why. This is why the 16-word announcement on November 28th felt both inevitable and tragic. It was the moment the king finally acknowledged what the crown had known for years. The bridge he had hoped to preserve could no longer bear the weight placed upon it. The earliest signs of this shift didn't arrive through headlines or confrontation, but through the subtle rhythms of those who worked closest to the monarchy. And it was Catherine, observant, steady, and sensitive to the smallest changes, who first sensed the tightening undercurrent long before the public suspected anything amiss. It began during a spring briefing at Kensington Palace in a modest room lined with archival photographs, where her team reviewed a routine report on public sentiment across Britain and the United States. Most of it was predictable continued support for William, admiration for the Wales children, steady approval of King Charles's modernisation, but one data set made her pause. A cross-Atlantic survey showing that 59% of British respondents felt Meghan should have no future involvement in royal activities, while 47% of Americans over 50 believed the palace had treated her too harshly. It wasn't the numbers themselves that unsettled Catherine, but what they represented. A monarchy thrives on unity, predictability, and clarity, and when two major audiences hold opposing interpretations of the same figure, a fault line forms that never stays quiet for long. She tucked the page back into the folder, but the unease lingered, sharpening weeks later when, during a private walkthrough at Windsor, she overheard two staff members discussing an unusual request from the Communications Office, a briefing outlining potential long-term scenarios regarding the Duchess of Sussex. The phrasing was vague, but the implication was clear. Something was being evaluated not temporarily, but permanently, and in the royal household, reviews of that kind never appeared without cause. The moment that confirmed her instincts came midsummer during a gathering at Sandringham, a simple lunch meant to bring senior family members together, where the atmosphere was subdued and more formal than usual. Catherine noticed William exchange a weighted glance with his father. Their conversations were clipped and careful, and at one point Charles rested both hands on the table, his posture weary, murmuring to William, "We need alignment. The current path cannot continue." Later, while walking through the gardens, Catherine told her private secretary that it was the first time she sensed the course of the family was shifting for good. Charles was no longer hoping for future reconciliation, but preparing for a definitive decision. A shift subtle, yet unmistakable. Outside the family, tension was building as American media, particularly outlets like People, MSNBC, and CBS circulated recurring debates about Meghan's unrealized role and whether she might one day resume certain charitable responsibilities, while British papers such as The Telegraph and The Times published opinion pieces arguing that the monarchy needed clear, permanent boundaries regarding its estranged members. The contrast between the two national narratives grew sharper each month. The tipping point arrived unexpectedly in late autumn when Catherine received a confidential poll summary from an independent research group that often advised the palace. It revealed something far more serious than shifting opinions among British respondents over 60. Trust in the monarchy's long-term stability was increasingly tied to how decisively it handled unresolved family fractures, and the Sussex situation ranked at the top of concerns, above finances and even constitutional debates. That detail unsettled Catherine deeply. Public trust wasn't merely loosening, it was fraying. That same week, she overheard a senior staffer mention that several diplomatic partners had quietly asked for clarification about Meghan's status during recent meetings. Not out of criticism, but confusion, as they didn't know what to tell their press departments without a clear definition of her role. Catherine realized, then, that the question was no longer whether Meghan could return in any capacity, but how long the Crown could continue functioning without drawing a line. And as November 28th drew nearer, the quiet tension sharpened into something heavier and impossible to ignore. By early November, conversations inside Buckingham Palace had taken on a more deliberate tone, shifting from quiet worries to structured strategic discussions. The issue had moved beyond emotion or relationship repair and into the realm of institutional planning, where every word, gesture, and silence carried consequences across continents. At the center of that tightening web stood Queen Camilla, whose instincts for public mood and press temperature had become indispensable to King Charles. Camilla was the first to notice a troubling trend in international coverage. American media, especially networks watched by older viewers like CBS, NBC, and CNN, had begun revisiting Meghan's royal history in long-form segments. Not lightweight pieces, but reflective, contextual explorations centered increasingly on a question palace advisors could no longer ignore. Would Meghan ever return to a formal royal role? At the same time, British outlets like The Telegraph and The Times published editorials urging the Crown to resolve its lingering ties, creating a stark contrast in tone. American commentators focused on personal reinvention and Hollywood independence, while British columnists emphasized duty, stability, and the need for clear institutional boundaries. Camilla recognized what this divergence meant. The monarchy was being defined by narratives it did not control, and in her experience, the longer silence lingered, the harder it became to reclaim the story. So she convened a private meeting in the White Drawing Room at Clarence House, inviting senior advisors in communications, diplomacy, and constitutional affairs, with one simple topic but immense stakes: Meghan's long-term status. On the table lay 3 thick folders of press summaries. One advisor flipped through articles with growing concern, noting that the Washington Post had run 3 pieces in 2 weeks about unresolved royal fractures, highly unusual, while another pointed out increased engagement from older American viewers, the demographic most closely tied to the Diana era. Camilla exhaled and tapped the folder lightly. "If we do not speak," she said, "others will speak for us." As discussions deepened, Princess and joined the process, bringing her characteristic pragmatism and intolerance for ambiguity. She made her view plain: the institution cannot support half definitions anymore. People need to know where things stand, and so do we. A perspective rooted not in emotion, but in decades of safeguarding the stability of the crown by eliminating uncertainty wherever it threatened to spread. Then came William, whose presence shifted the atmosphere the moment he entered. He had been briefed weeks earlier and said little at first, but the firmness in his posture revealed the weight of his conviction. When he finally spoke, he was measured but resolute. Ambiguity invites speculation. Speculation fuels division. We cannot continue like this. No one disagreed. The next stage was drafting potential statements, 3 versions. One diplomatic, one more direct, and one that drew a definitive boundary. The third, calm but irrevocable, commanded the most attention. It stated that Meghan would not return to royal duties, would not resume patronages, and that her future position was fully detached from institutional obligations. It emphasized modernization, clarity, and structural necessity, avoiding blame or bitterness, the language of a monarchy closing a chapter. Yet before finalizing anything, Camilla requested a detailed media risk assessment, and the results were sobering. British sentiment leaned heavily toward finality, while American audiences, especially older viewers, were split, sympathetic to Meghan's independence, yet uneasy about the unresolved tensions. Globally, confusion was growing, and diplomatic partners had begun quietly asking the palace for clarity because their own press departments no longer knew how to respond. Then one younger aide, confident enough to speak with candor, offered an insight that lingered with everyone in the room. It wasn't about personalities anymore, it was about coherence. People didn't know where Meghan stood, and as long as that remained unclear, the story kept rewriting itself. That was the moment the decision became unavoidable. The announcement would be released on November 28th, its tone soft, controlled, but final, the door closing not with anger, but with institutional necessity. Inside the palace, preparations began immediately. Wording was refined, diplomatic partners were quietly informed, senior royals were briefed, and by dawn on the 28th the entire household understood that nothing remained but to press publish. When the palace released the statement at 7:32 that morning, it wasn't angry or dramatic, it was final. There will be no future return to royal duties for the Duchess of Sussex, and no reinstatement of any previous roles or patronages. A single sentence, polished to perfection. And for Meghan, it landed like a quiet thunderclap. In Montecito, where the California morning light had barely begun to seep into the room, her phone erupted with notifications. Those close to her say she had expected some form of internal update before year's end. But not now. She stared at the headline, then the full statement beneath it, the calmness of the language somehow sharpening its impact. What struck her most wasn't just the message, but the unmistakable unity behind it. King Charles and Prince William standing together, publicly aligned, leaving no space for speculation or reversal. For Meghan, who had once believed a middle path might exist, a hybrid role, a modernized partnership, a reimagined model of duty, this closed the last chapter of that possibility. Media reactions were instantaneous. Within minutes, the announcement topped the front pages of The Times and The Telegraph, which framed it as long overdue clarification, while British broadcasters called it measured and institutionally necessary. In America, however, coverage was more emotional. CBS described it as a painful full stop. CNN called it a tragic acknowledgement of a fractured family with no path back. And West Coast morning shows debated whether this marked a step toward stability or confirmation that reconciliation had slipped out of reach. Inside Buckingham Palace, the atmosphere remained controlled, but heavy as senior aides moved quietly through departments. ensuring every partner organization, patronage, and major newsroom had received the official wording. This was not damage control, it was completion, the closing of open files, and the end of ambiguity. William, according to a senior source, spent the morning in back-to-back briefings, his demeanor steady, but marked by a gravity those close to him recognized. He had long accepted that protecting the crown required decisions that would inevitably wound people he once loved deeply. And though the public would interpret the announcement as his victory or his demand, the truth was far less triumphant. It was necessity, not conquest, that guided him. For Charles, the decision carried an even deeper sorrow. Those familiar with his thinking said he had held out hope longer than anyone, perhaps too long, believing time and distance might settle the chaos into something manageable. But the pressures had grown too loud to ignore. Diplomatic partners needed clarity, British public trust needed reassurance, internal staff needed direction, and the constant swirl of transatlantic coverage from People to the Washington Post had made silence untenable. The fallout for Harry began almost immediately. He received the formal briefing early, and those familiar with the exchange said he responded quietly. Without anger, it was not confrontation but resignation. Confirmation of the distance he had sensed widening for months, a space neither side knew how to cross. As the news spread, global reactions fractured. Older British viewers called the decision sad but practical, emphasizing the monarchy's need for clarity, while American audiences, especially those over 50 and deeply shaped by the memory of Princess Diana, expressed a more conflicted grief, some seeing Meghan as unfairly cornered, others viewing the crown's actions as overdue firmness. Yet the most telling responses came from within the Sussex Circle in California, where friends described Meghan as composed but deeply shaken not by the loss of duties, but by the symbolism, by the severing of the final thread connecting her to the institution she had once married into, leaving her future to unfold entirely outside the framework she once tried to navigate. As dusk settled in London and global debate churned, one truth stood immovable. The monarchy had made its decision quiet, calculated, irreversible. In the hours after the November 28th announcement, the institution entered a period of controlled stillness, the kind that follows a long-delayed decision finally delivered. But beyond the palace walls, that stillness didn't hold. Reactions rippled through government offices, diplomatic channels, media networks, and both royal households. Inside Buckingham Palace, senior staff gathered around a long oak table, not for crisis management, but for structural realignment to update public records, legal positions, and communication protocols, now that the last ambiguity around Meghan's royal status had been removed. A constitutional advisor, reviewing the documents with deliberate precision, summed up the new reality. With today's statement, there was no legal or procedural basis for any future expectation of duties. William, according to a senior source, spent the morning in back-to-back briefings, his demeanor steady though marked by a gravity that those familiar with him recognized. He had long understood that protecting the crown required choices that would inevitably wound the people he once loved most. And though the public might see the announcement as his victory, it was necessity, not triumph, that shaped his posture. For Charles, the decision carried an even deeper sorrow. For those close to him knew he had held out hope longer than anyone, perhaps too long, that time and distance might settle the chaos into something manageable. Yet the pressures surrounding the monarchy had grown too loud to ignore. Diplomatic partners needed clarity, public trust needed reassurance, staff needed direction, and the transatlantic swirl of coverage from People to the Washington Post had rendered silence untenable. Fallout for Harry began almost immediately. Briefed privately before the news broke, he responded quietly, without anger, his reaction less confrontation than resignation, a weary acknowledgement that the space between him and his family had widened into a distance no statement could bridge. As reactions spread, older British viewers called the decision sad but practical, while American audiences, especially those over 50 and shaped by memories of Princess Diana, wrestled with conflicted emotions. Admiration for Meghan's independence mixing with frustration over the unresolved rift. Within the Sussex Circle in California, the responses were even more revealing. Friends said Meghan absorbed the announcement in a long silence before returning to her desk, shaken not by the loss of duties, but by the symbolism of finality, understanding that her future would now unfold entirely outside the institution she once entered with hope. By afternoon, William maintained a composure that surprised even those closest to him no relief. Just resolve, while Catherine, receiving her own briefings, felt the emotional weight differently. Compassion for Harry, concern for the institution, and sadness for what the family had lost, yet clarity that the decision, however painful, had become necessary after years of living in a grey area that bred confusion for staff and global audiences alike. Across Britain, callers on radio shows expressed sympathy for Charles and Camilla after years of tension, while in the US, networks in New York and Los Angeles hosted heated panels, debating whether the monarchy had acted too late or too harshly. As evening fell and London lights reflected off the Thames, the monarchy settled into a new phase, neither triumphant nor vindictive, simply defined, its long uncertain question finally answered. And as night closed over the palace grounds, a chapter ended softly but irrevocably, carrying the gravity of a story reaching the point where hope gives way to acceptance. For many viewers, it felt less like a political shift and more like the close of a family journey that began with optimism and slowly unraveled in front of millions. Meghan had entered the monarchy carrying promises of modernity and reinvention, ideals resonant with American audiences, but institutions built on centuries of continuity cannot bend easily to the pace of personal transformation. And when the two forces collided, neither side walked away unscathed. Here lies the deeper lesson that reaches beyond royal headlines. Families, royal or otherwise, face moments when boundaries must be drawn not out of spite but self-preservation. Relationships evolve, expectations shift, and sometimes clarity becomes the only kindness left. Love and loyalty do not always guarantee alignment, and when communication falters, narratives harden, distances widen, and even well-intentioned bridges can no longer bear the weight placed upon them. Yet within this ending rests a quieter truth: freedom and responsibility often arrive together. Meghan now steps into a future shaped entirely by her own choices, free from royal expectation, while the monarchy enters a steadier phase defined by clarity rather than conflict. The story does not end here. It simply settles into a new form, one that will continue to unfold in ways neither side can fully predict, reminding us that life often forces us to confront the unsaid, accept what can no longer continue, and shape futures that must, inevitably, move apart. Thank you for staying through this journey.